Hi, my name is Meg McGuire. It's great to be here with you all today. Last year, I spent my Wednesday evenings with a group of 20 people in the basement of a synagogue in Oakland. If you'd seen our group through the tiny courtyard window, you might have noticed the folding chairs arranged in a lopsided circle, or the table of Trader Joe's snacks at the back of the room, or maybe the name tags that we wore week after week. You might have noticed the visible range of ages represented, or the diversity of clothing, alluding to differences in both class and cultural background. You might have noticed the sometimes tearful moments of silence, or maybe the way in which the group fixated its attention on each person as they shared. You might have noticed that there was palpable love in the room. From the window, you might have guessed that we were a support group for people coping with grief or loss. In a way, we were. What you may or may not have noticed was that every person in the group appeared to be white. You may or may not have guessed that that was the commonality that brought us to that room each week. That the loss we were supporting one another through was the loss of illusions. Illusions that we benefited from a system that harmed other people. Illusions of our separateness, our innocence, and our guilt. The group was a course for white-identified people who were committed to the painstaking work of bringing into being a racially just society through personal, interpersonal, and structural truth-telling and transformation. This past month, I've had the great pleasure of accompanying two groups like this, made up mostly of people from this congregation. One of the premises of these groups is that white people have work to do among ourselves, that we must educate ourselves and each other, that we must hold ourselves and one another accountable, and that we must learn to love ourselves and each other more fiercely and more unconditionally, so that we may transform ourselves and our world. Of course, groups like this are nothing new. For years, they've been one steady response among many to the racialized injustice that has plagued our country for centuries. Today, the call for transformation is clearer than ever, and more people are taking up their own parts of this work. For my part, I share these reflections today knowing that this is not a group of white people talking about whiteness, but a multiracial religious community. I feel the slipperiness, even the scariness of deliberately taking up space to talk about whiteness, when whiteness takes up so much unacknowledged space already. And still, I believe that we must broach this subject in mixed-race spaces, both to build a culture of accountability and to root in the reality that healing is a collective endeavor. I believe that we must wrestle with the paradox, that the transformation of white supremacy culture is largely the task of white people, that racial justice work must be led by people and communities of color. And as William Oliver suggests, that healing must be collective, both in its process and its benefits. And I believe in our capacity to hold these seemingly contradictory truths. To all of you who live in Black and brown bodies, I am grateful for your grace and the generosity it takes to be here as we learn and grow. To all of you who live in white bodies, I'm grateful for your willingness to sit with hard truths, to take risks, and to be vulnerable. To all of you, I am grateful for your courage and commitment as we struggle together to live into a different story. A different story. What does it mean to embody a different story about whiteness? What might a new story feel like? And what are the stories about whiteness that have brought us to this point? White anti-racist facilitator Gregory Mendel outlines two dominant stories of whiteness: whiteness as innocence and whiteness as guilt. The story of whiteness as innocence is a familiar one. It goes something like this. Racism is over. Whatever historic violations may have taken place have been accounted for. Plenty of time has passed, and the racism is no longer to blame for societal inequity. The only form of racism that remains is the individual biases of those people over there, not us. The story of whiteness as guilt, though untold explicitly, may be even more familiar to many of you. It is to me. It goes, being white is something to be ashamed of. White people have committed horrible atrocities from which there can be no redemption. We must do something to help. But since we haven't figured out what that is, we should just feel terrible and make sure others do the same. These seemingly opposite stories, Mendel asserts, are really two sides of the same narrative. They reinforce one another, and neither are doing very much to end white supremacy. Neither innocence nor guilt comes close to representing the complicated truth of our situation in this country in this moment. Neither of these stories leave room for the reality that we individually are neither innocent of nor personally culpable for the long history of violations on which this country is built. Neither leave room for the possibility that we may not be individually to blame, but we remain nevertheless responsible. Embedded as we are in a society where we regularly judge one another on this binary of innocence or guilt, perhaps it is no surprise that imagining a different story is challenging. And yet this is our task, to imagine and bring into being a different story. Today we are called to this task by our social media feeds, by the news, by homemade yard signs, and by demonstrations on our streets. But we know that this call to heal the lineages of racial injustice and thus to live into a story of whiteness without supremacy is one that has been put forth by Black visionary authors, activists, and public intellectuals for decades. I personally am indebted in particular to the generous work of James Baldwin, Ruby Sales, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Resmaa Menakem, to name just a few. There is a thread that runs through these authors' work that white people have an essential role to play in dismantling white supremacy. Menakem goes a step further, arguing that if America is to grow out of what he calls white body supremacy, that transformation must be led by white Americans. This invitation from these African American authors is profoundly clarifying and generous. And still discerning what this transformation requires of those of us who are white is far from easy. Living into this task, into a new story, is terrifying and almost always messy. And yet, I take comfort in the fact that we do not have to do it alone. In community, perhaps especially in religious community, we can rest in the gifts of support, accountability, and co-creation. Knowing that there can be no one model for what white anti-racism looks like, I offer you a few touchstones that I've gleaned from my religious community and from the generous invitation and loving challenge of so many Black visionaries. First and foremost, this work means increasing our capacity to be uncomfortable. You might be noticing that this sermon makes you feel uncomfortable. And if that's true, that's great. We must build resilience in our bodies and grow the capacity in our hearts. We must strengthen our ability to sit with hard truths and to feel and move through pain. And we must take seriously the realization that part of white supremacy culture is the expectation that the ease, comfort, and safety of white people will be prioritized above others. We must begin to ask different questions about what comfort means and for who. This work involves deepening our understanding of who we are and where we come from, honestly engaging in our personal and collective histories, naming the ways in which our ancestors, of blood or otherwise, have enacted and been complicit in structural and interpersonal violence. It means learning from the past and courageously engaging in the ways in which the legacies of our past live on in our present. This means taking responsibility, which does not mean guilt. It does mean full acknowledgement of our collective biography and deep commitment to continued engagement with the hard truths therein. Courageously engaging our histories is instrumental for healing. For in addition to taking seriously the weight of our legacies, this work brings to light the ways in which white supremacy has harmed and continues to harm white people too, pale as they may be besides the ways that white supremacy ravages communities of color. It's crucial that we do this work without centering whiteness or downplaying the fundamental imbalance of past and present harm. And yet having a clear sense of our mutual stake in this work is ultimately indispensable to our long-term sustainability and right action. As religious communities, we have a special, critically important role to play here. Resmaa Menakem, the author of the best-selling book, My Grandmother's Hands, that many of us have been working with this summer, asserts that dismantling white supremacy requires that we build life-affirming culture and liberatory ways of reconnecting, remembering, and recreating meaning. A police consultant and somatic therapist, he offers this challenge. White allies must build culture because culture trumps almost anything else. Menakem emphasizes again that neither he nor any non-white person can lead this work or tell white people what it entails. But he does suggest that a new life-affirming culture must include new narratives or stories, ritual, ceremony, systems for mentorship and meaning-making, and robust practices for self and community care. Which sounds to me a lot like the work of religious community. Civil rights icon Ruby Sales offers a related call for a liberating white theology. A theology that speaks to white people who are so often told that our essence, our very worthiness, is in power and domination. She calls for a theology that gives hope and meaning to people who are struggling in a world where they are no longer as essential to whiteness as they once were. A theology that can raise people from disposability to essentiality. This sounds a whole lot like the work of religious community to me. Baldwin, Sales, Coates, and Menakem all emphasize a truth that is at once deeply simple and persistently difficult. That this work involves learning to love ourselves. Baldwin offers that white people in this country have quite enough to do in learning how to accept and love themselves and each other. And when they have achieved this, which will not be tomorrow and may well be never, the race problem will no longer exist, for it will no longer be needed. Love must be at the center of this work, which sounds a whole lot like the work of religious community to me. For as white anti-racist organizer Chris Krass lays out, all of our lives, including white people's lives, are at stake in the fight against white supremacy. Our hearts, our minds, our souls, our children, and our communities. The more we name and acknowledge the ways that white supremacy pervades our communities, the more clear it becomes that, as Ruby Sales suggests, there is a profound spiritual crisis in white America. I remember the largely white context where I was raised. And I remember the epidemics of depression, loneliness, addiction, suicide, and anger, and the ways that these wounds were taken as normal. I remember the ways that these epidemics harmed my family, my friends, and my neighbors. And I remember the ways that they harmed me. This is one of the reasons that I commit myself to this work. I remember these stories as I remember Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Philando Castile, Akai Gurley, Tanisha Anderson, and so many others. Each of their lives its own reason, its own mandate to this work. Holding these together makes no comparisons, nor trivializes the weight of death and violence that is inflicted on those who live in Black bodies. It asserts that all of us are harmed, in different ways and to different degrees. But nevertheless, that white supremacy is a collective wound. That we endeavor to heal this wound does not mean insisting that it is possible to be whole again. It means humbly dedicating ourselves to the process, to the ongoing work of our collective liberation. It's been a privilege to do a little piece of this work with so many in this congregation. For those of you who have dedicated part of your summer to the study of my grandmother's hands, you may have noticed that this work is difficult. Difficult to imagine, and even more difficult to do. And you may have noticed that it's a little easier when we're in it together. I am buoyed by the immense courage, vulnerability, and commitment that I experienced in our time together this month. I'm heartened by each of your strength and humanity. And I hold on to something that a friend once offered to me. This isn't just the work we have to do. This is the work we get to do. What a blessing it is. What a blessing it is to begin the work to reclaim our full humanity. What a blessing it is to begin to imagine and live into a different story of whiteness without supremacy, of a world without racialized injustice. What a blessing it is to try, to fall short, and to try again. What a blessing it is to take these steady steps down this path toward our individual and collective liberation. This is the work we get to do.